interested the qualification of what is happening in Ukraine with regard to Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Will it be qualified by the State Department? And should we wait for a next report? It's a good pretext to publish a press release, maybe in Russian, and tell everyone how the United States of America sees all these outrageous events in Ukraine. How can they qualify them? The Westerners conceal their Ukrainians and observing in silence how they get rid of the largest confession of the religious group of the country. It's not a religious group. These are people who believe and who are now following this religion. It's not a destruction of books, but it's just a norm for the West. It's destruction of the belief of the people. It's an attempt to rewrite the consciousness and to reload their consciousness, their will, their mentality. In Ukraine, there is a fight and is ongoing with the heroes of the Red Army. In the settlement Badnarov, in the Ivano-Frankivsk Oblast, now I quote, "In order to protect the cultural heritage of Ukraine, they plan to demount the monument of to the hero of the Soviet Union, Alexander Kurikov, and he died for liberation of Ukraine from the Nazis when he was 21. So they plan, and I quote, to excavate, exhume, and rebury its remnants at this settlement." So this democracy reached the Ivano-Frankivsk region. Those who stay indifferent say that if it continues, so it is left to wait how Zelensky will decide to desecrate the tomb of his own grandfather. And I won't be surprised, because in the state he is, so he can do anything. Verkhovna Rada introduced a bill on the cancellation of the so-called Soviet anniversaries. So what are the Soviet anniversaries in Ukraine which can be cancelled to make everything for everyone to forget them? And you cannot believe this, the 8th of March, the Soviet Day, it's International Women's Day. And the fact that it came to the Soviet Union from the West, and the Kyiv regime does not care about it, because these people stay ignorant, and I'm confident that these dehumanization processes which we see in Ukraine, I refer to exhumation of borders of the heroes of the Red Army who liberated the country from fascism, up to rewriting history. We can hardly name them as supporters of their moral image. But the 8th of March, it's International Women's Day. It's not a Soviet holiday. And I would like to remind you, maybe someone should be reminded of this, maybe someone forgot, but I believe in the territory of Ukraine, the authorities do not have people who know something, who heard something about the world history. It was Clara Zetkin, Rosa Luxemburg. They were not quite Soviet. They were not Soviet at all. And I would like to repeat, these holidays they call the Soviet victory, the 8th of February, is celebrated not only in Russia, but all over the world. Once again, it's an International Women's Day. So what other holidays are interfering the Kyiv regime? The 1st of May, you cannot believe it. They need to cancel it, and then life will be good. And of course, the Victory Day. And it's not surprising, taking into account what they are doing with the heroes of the Great Patriotic War. So these holidays, they want to replace by the Ukrainian holidays. So which holidays? For example, a Women's Day, they want to celebrate on the 25th of February. And you cannot be surprised by this date, because they are rewriting and replacing everything upside down. If earlier February was a kind of a month of celebrating all together the independence, the Hero Day, now you can celebrate the day linked to the Ukrainian woman. So they want to make it a day of the Ukrainian woman, or the day of Lesya Ukrainka. So what will be on the 9th of March? And on the 9th of March, they plan to make a holiday, a Shevchenko Day, or the day of the birth of Taras Shevchenko. The 1st and the 9th of May now will be working days, and the 8th of May will be proclaimed as the day of memory and reconciliation. So you understand, no one is talking about great patriotic war, about the victory. Of course, I believe that they will refer to victory in Europe in the international context, but for them, this will be a day of memory and reconciliation. In order to be closer to its American, European hosts, the Kyiv regime is ready to use everything. It does not care that he will need to destroy the peaceful cities of Donbass, the historical truth, or something that is left, a kind of a critical thought. We paid attention to another portion of false confirmations of the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, Mr. Kuleba.
Well, I believe it is a masterpiece. He managed to make his personal record, so to say. A direct quotation. The Russian Empire was created by the French, the Germans and Ukrainians. And now it's up to us, to them, to the Kyiv regime, to decide what to do with it next. End of quotation. I have just one question. Was the Russian Empire created by the French, the Germans and Ukrainians in that particular order? So the French began with it, then followed the Germans and then the Ukrainians. That's how it was, not in the opposite order. Or has it nothing to do with historical dates? It is just incredible. The Rurikovics have nothing to do with it, are they rather French or closer to the Ukrainians? Well, apparently the primitive Russophobia and the desire to cancel Russia is something that drives many people in Kyiv crazy, moves them towards schizophrenia and the delusion of grandeur. But nothing can justify such statements of Kuleba. I would like to see him elaborating on this issue. While it might seem difficult to bypass this figure, but there are those who follow up on these ideas. As you know, some days ago, the New York Museum Metropolitan decided to identify as Ukrainians the great Russian artists such as Ivan Aivazovsky, Ilya Repin, and Arkiv Quincy. Let me tell the Metropolitan Museum that when they were alive, not only did they give their names to the pictures, but those were real people. They are not characters from myths or legends. Those were living people with birth dates, and they also had a gender image. And they also could speak about themselves on their own. So in their lifetime, they themselves, well, back then they had the right to operate with facts, something they're trying to cancel right now in the West. So in their lifetimes, they said they considered themselves as Russians. Well, apparently it meant something to them. Or will we deprive them of their right, that same right that has always existed to preserve their memory and the truth about the people who have passed away. But the question is even broader. Right now, it seems that we are witnessing how the greatest museum, a major museum, is engaged in anti-scientific activity. It is not only politicization, it is not a mistake or an error, it is anti-scientific activity if you have facts substantiated by some documents and you start to twist these facts, to distort them in a deliberate manner, and if you do it publicly, if you turn it all into a campaign, then it is nothing but anti-scientific campaign. Didn't the art historians in the New York Museum know about the biographic facts of these Russian artists? Well, of course they did. At least there were some people who did. Or what happened in the Metropolitan Museum? Was the director of this museum captured, or some other people who can operate with facts? So what happened there? Well, you know, in that case, it is not only falsification that would fit into the Western line to cancel the Russian culture. It is outright fraud. It is something law enforcement agencies should deal with. So what is to follow? Right now, they show to us how the people who have passed away, the famous people about whom there are many documents and many facts, can become subject to such fraudulent actions. They can be called people of a different nationality, apparently of different citizenship, although they even had passports. They had both certificates. And what is to follow? Let me tell you. And don't you think that it is a fantasy? Well, not at all. It's simply a logical chain of events. Later, they will change names. Just the same thing they did to the nationality. In the United States of America, everyone had to accept it. And as a next step, such wild art historians will probably change the names of the painters. For example, they cross the name Raphael and write the name of a US painter instead in order to make him or her famous for centuries. But something opposite may happen. Quite legally, they may take the name of an unknown painter and attribute to him some famous pieces of art or something different. They may take some unknown paintings and attribute these paintings to some famous authors. The process has already been launched. So what's to follow? What's next? In the same chain of events, they can change the dates. Because what does it matter? It makes no difference. If without any facts, despite the existing facts, one can change the citizenship and the nationality, then everything can be changed. Do you think they will stop at this? No. As a next step, they will change the gender and say that Ayvazovsky, well, why not Michelangelo, were not men? Well, I'm quite sure they could say they were transgenders. Why not? For example, with regards to such historical and famous characters described and personalities described in the literature. It is already happening. For example, the British so-called researchers already say that everything that was described in the New Testament happened to a transgender, or whatever they called the person who didn't have any gender. They already started with it. What is to follow? Ayvazovsky, Quincy, and Rapin will probably turn out to be women, because it makes no difference. In the same vein, they can change the race. Well, for example, yesterday I saw the cover. Well, I didn't believe it, but we have checked it. And indeed, it turned out it was true. Characters of a Dumas roman were not Europeans, but people of different races. That's how today's painter sees it, and that's something they want to make us accept. So that's the question to those who should give a legal evaluation to such things. The West has succeeded in nurturing the criminals, but it doesn't have enough power to nurture the artists, so it has to steal something that the West has succeeded in the past time, to steal in a shameless manner. The West sends clear signals that it intends to continue to allocate billions to support the Kyiv regime drowning in blood and corruption, although it is a heavy burden for common Europeans. Ukrainian authorities, serving the interests of the Western hegemons, are determined to lead the war until the last Ukrainian and implement the campaign to break spiritual and cultural ties between Russia and Ukraine, between common people, despite the interests of these people who have to participate in this. They can't utter a word because saying in Ukraine what one thinks has become dangerous in Ukraine long before 2022. Many human rights defenders and journalists have been killed. I'm sure you know it pretty well. However, they are trying to harm Russia. The truth will dominate, and it has been the case in history on many occasions. More and more countries realize the deceitful nature of Western policy and see that the West is attempting to preserve dominance by any means. Speaking about manipulations and lies, we see that the collective West tries to use it. Let me draw your attention to the statement of the Russian inter-agency staff. It points to the fact that the Western authorities continue to follow the way of provocations and accuse Russia of violating the nuclear security. The Kyiv regime is to provide the world some facts to prove the fact that Russian servicemen close to the Chernobyl nuclear power plant led to a contamination of a wide part of Ukraine. What's interesting that searcher information campaigns are groundless. They haven't been substantiated by any data. Ukrainian authorities use any occasion to seed disinformation about nuclear threats allegedly coming from Russia. Though, let me stress, the main source of such threats are Ukrainians themselves, and It's because the shellings come from the part of the Ukrainian army. And Madam Nuland also made a statement that Washington supports, just think of it, attacks by Ukraine against Russian military infrastructure in Crimea. Also, she believes that the Russian peninsula should be demilitarized. Well, it's yet another time when we have to state that the US is involved into the conflict. They supply it with weapons, provide intelligence, and directly participate in planning of military operations. They train military soldiers, and they have been doing so for a long time in 2022 and even before. Washington has banned Kyiv regime from conducting negotiations with Russia. They say Ukraine should wage the war until the last Ukrainian, and now they have gone even further. They incite the Kyiv regime to further escalation. They want to move the war to our country, the territory of our country, with direct attacks, something we have warned of for a long time. That's what forced us to launch the special military operation. Right now, the high-level officials of the U.S. state it in an open and shameless manner. Years before, they had incited this war, and now they have switched to direct calls, direct encouragements. The words by Nuland is nothing but an attempt to disguise their wish to see our country defeated. We know how they hit civilian infrastructure. There are lots of facts, and on many occasions did we draw the statistics, including international organizations, and we have started counting it not since February 2022, but since 2014, because attacks against civil infrastructure have always been a coveted target of those who, with the hands of the Kyiv regime, managed the situation and directed it to a direct conflict. And Victoria Nuland was involved in it personally. Let me remind you, in 2014, after the anti-constitutional and armed coup d'etat that happened in Kyiv, the shellings against Donbass began. I think I don't have to remind you that Kyiv is protected in due manner. It is in the competence of the Ministry of Defense. They will give their comments and explanations, but I would like to give to Victoria Nuland the following advice. Victoria Nuland, do deal better with the balloons and UFOs. There are lots of them over the United States, and as we see, you haven't been quite successful in dealing with these unidentified flying objects. Your own people are laughing at you, and you are still dreaming of seeing Russia defeated. And now you even call the Kyiv regime to start an attack against Russia and against Crimea. Victoria, you have something to do at home, apart from the UFO. And by the way, the US has established a whole commission to deal with it. I would like to remind Victoria Nuland that in the near East Palestine, 50 cars derailed. They contained hazardous chemicals. What's happening now in the US state seems to be the largest man-made disaster over the past years in terms of the threat it poses to the environment, lives and health of people. And what's interesting, the alarming details have become known just recently. Why? Because, you won't believe it, they didn't give access to the media, media access to the site. Well, Victoria Nuland, as a person, as a public personality, probably should take under personal control the situation where 50 cars with hazardous chemical substances derailed. Do tell us what's happening in the US. Please do add some democracy into the life in the US. That's something your people have been missing. And during the efforts to extinguish the fire set off by the incident, it was decided to conduct a controlled release of the substances which pose a threat to the human health. More precisely, they depressurized some containers and performed a controlled incineration under the pretext that cisterns could have exploded on their own due to overheat. As a result, around 5,000 people have been evacuated. Those who lived within a 2-mile radius of this site, and soil was contaminated. Deaths of poultry have been detected. This demonstrates how the Western news-making machine is working, while declaring their commitment to the green agenda and accusing other countries in not ambitious enough environmental efforts. The U.S. administration, the Biden administration, keeps silent about the U.S. failures that are due to the faults of local regulators that govern the transport of hazardous goods and substances. In every country, I stress, in every country, there is a threat of dangerous incidents. It happens in many countries. Sometimes it's due to mistakes or natural disasters. It's because our world is imperfect and the men are imperfect. And it's always with a sense of sympathy that we lend a helping hand, as it is happening, for example, now with regard to Turkey and Syria.
And here we are, of course, really feel sympathy, understand the destiny and the situation with regarding to this situation in Ohio. But this is a small detail. Stop lecturing us. Now, I tell Victoria Nuland and all her colleagues in the State Department, stop lecturing the whole world how to live. So show with your own example that you can live in good neighborhoodness, with good quality. This is your loved indicator in an honest way. So show us, show to us. And everyone will be attracted, but you do the opposite. You conceal your own problems. Moreover, the concealment of your own problems aggravates the global problems as it has been for decades. And you are shameless enough to lecture everyone else how to live. And if this kind of a disaster happened in any country of the world, for example, in China, India, or Russia, any other country, so this will be news number one for every American and European mass media. And I'm sure that in this case, even the situation in Ukraine will be pushed aside, and everyone will be crying out this technological disaster. They would remember everything. First of all, they would say that there is no democracy in this country, or it's not the way it should be. Of course, they should have told us how these countries do not comply with their ecological standards promoted by the United States across the globe. Of course, they would have mentioned the human rights dimension. They would have showed human sufferings because of the government actions. All international agenda would be announcing loudly and urging. Now, you have a good possibility to train with yourselves, so you can go to the relevant structures, UN bodies. Now I'm referring to the US officials. You can question yourselves. You can tell us, everyone, what is happening with this technological man-made disaster in your country. Everything that you can do, you can apply to yourselves. However, this disaster happened in the United States. Now they are trying to silence this event and to deliberately downplay its significance, as it was in Kansas when there was a leak, oil leak, when for many weeks they silenced. I refer to all environmental agencies as if they hadn't seen anything, because it was the oil of the very specific state, and they did not receive money for this news. They can be taken out of their money if they start to voice this out. Now, what is happening in the United States? The Biden administration was let out of the information attack here. Now, let us return to the human rights. As a tradition, on 21st of February, we celebrate the International Mother Language Day. It was introduced by UNESCO in 1999. This event promotes language diversity and protects endangered languages, of course, the language of the national minorities. In this context, it is unacceptable, the ongoing attacks of some states to restrict the Russian language. Every day, their actions are becoming more outrageous. On spurious grounds, they are closing the centers of Russian language, Russian schools. They exert pressure on journalists. They cancel Russian language departments in universities and reassign into the groups of Slavic languages. In the framework of this discriminatory anti-Russian campaign, they almost frozen the activity of the Russian world and other educational institutions. There are violations of Russian-speaking population in Ukraine. They're just outrageous violations. It's everywhere, and it's extreme manifestations. It's true barbarism. The Russian language is cleansed out from the system of education in Ukraine, in science, sports, and culture. Civil servants, as well as clergy and common citizens, including children, are persecuted for the use of the Russian language in their daily life. The Baltic states and Moldavia states continue their course to assimilate the Russian-speaking population and to oust the Russian language. We are observing with concern the language policy of our closest partners. So in their desire, they cannot act at the expense of the Russian language. I would like to remind you that the year 2023 was declared in CIS the year of the Russian language as a language of interreligious communication. And I wish this period would be marked not only by multifaceted events, but also implementing of a balanced course, balanced policy aimed at the parallel development of the Russian and state languages, taking into account that the Russian language is an important element of the Russian and world culture, science, and education. Restriction of its use impedes the population's access to achieve various knowledges and expertise and reduce its competitiveness. So this way, these initiators of anti-Russia campaign will do a disservice to its citizens themselves. Of course, this requires an international response. On our part, we implement all necessary means and are ready to respond in order to support the education of the Russian language abroad. And I would like to add some words on the Council of NATO, the defense ministers. As I've said, on the 14th and 15th of November, there was a NATO meeting at the level of defense ministers. So they discussed another phase of militarization of Europe and the further increasing of potential of NATO to deter our country. So they focused, as tradition, on the issues of supporting the Kyiv regime in order to combat Russia. So this confrontation, NATO themselves reaffirmed, is becoming a heavy burden and is depleting the armaments and strategic arms of this alliance. In furnace of this conflict, they throw out billions of dollars, huge amounts of weapons destroyed by the Russian army on the battlefield. This meeting was preceded by the 9th mission meeting of the contact group in the former Ramstein. They discussed the questions of supplying Kyiv with weapons, as they write it, the spring counterattack. This is your spring outburst. So what was declared by our country and what the Russian government said and declared as the goals and objectives is being implemented, and I'm confident it will be implemented. Of course, despite and contrary to the hopes and desires of the so-called collective West, not the whole West. I'm not talking about people, because they do not understand what is happening with them by this regime. I'm talking about these Western NATO elites which are dreaming of how to use our resources, to use our land, to enslave people in terms of mental health, to destroy them. This will never happen. I believe how to sponsor the Kyiv regime, the questions, is becoming more and more difficult. Of course, they are not talking about the supplies of combat aircraft. So instead, they focused on a more economic use of these expensive Western weapons by Ukraine. This is top cynicism. They are urging this bloody Ukrainian population, exhausted and devastated by the Kyiv regime itself. They urge this population to use in a more economic way the Western weapons. It's a kind of a slavery rule to beat up to death any slave who dared to prepare a dish not from 2 chicken but out of 3 chicken, insulting the emotional health of his patron. It's top cynicism, it's cruelty, it's outrageous cruelty. It's not about people. They are not talking about people, no. They are thinking about how to use their own goals. So now the Ukrainian army are filling up with the manpower without counting any losses. So these are Ukrainian citizens. And how many passports and citizenship has Mr. Zelensky? I'm talking about the whole group of elite. Do they associate themselves with these people? Of course, no. They've never done so. They wanted to destroy the Ukrainian people. They're always talking about Russia, but they destroy their own people first of all. By the way, and I would like to underline, a multi-ethnic population of Ukraine. So this scenario, of course, settles the Kyiv supporters. They are cared not only about the destiny of Ukraine, rather than continuation of conflict with Russia. The main thing is that this will be done by some other hands and by some other blood. So they will contribute in an economic way. By the way, the NATO representatives cynically repeat that they are not a party to the conflict. In fact, by pumping Ukraine with new portions of lethal weapons, they have become not only accomplices, but contractors of the crimes of the Kyiv regime. It is also worth mentioning that devastating of their own arsenals makes the Ukrainian curators to think where is now the previously supplied weapons or its profits from the sales of such weapons has settled out in the pockets of the Kyiv officials. This is all chaos, the kind of collaborative joint efforts of the NATO cynical world. I believe that the pumping of Ukraine with weapons is organized by the Western countries in order to enrich the Western industry. First of all, the American one, in order to provide it with the contracts. It's not, we cannot explain it other way. It's the logic of slaves. So we cannot explain it by other means. The items which was ordered will be produced only in 2 or 3 years. So regular Europeans suffer from these actions, who will pay for all these banquets. This NATO meeting has once again showed that this alliance is continuously aggravating the situation in Europe, throwing more powers at confrontation with our country and creating hotbeds of instability along its perimeter. So this can end badly. Unfortunately, that recognition by the collective West can happen too late. And of course, one of the examples, and I would like to talk to it in terms of practice. Now I'm talking about the practice of coercion of neutral countries to control. They're trying to infringe Russia, and they force neutral states to respect anti-Russia sanctions. So the countries do not want to introduce or work out anti-Russia sanctions, not in its legislation, nor to maintain it. So then the United States are starting to intimidate them. So how they are doing it? We were talking about this during briefing on the 1st of February. Now another fact I can cite. We knew that several dozens of Russian vessels were banned from entering the ports of Bangladesh. We know that this unfriendly action was adopted by the country's authorities, not by their own initiative. It was used under the threat of using secondary sanctions on behalf of the United States. This is yet another example of this intimidation. Unfortunately, Dhaka has been yielding to this unceremonious pressure of Washington for the second time, and it threatens traditionally friendly Russian-Bangladesh relations on the wings of the third country, following its own geopolitical goals. We expect that the Bangladeshi authorities will find forces to decisively assert their national interests. Of course, it is in their interests to develop mutually beneficial partnership ties with Russia, which has always helped to this country in various periods of its history. Now, about man-made disasters, I'm talking about earthquakes in a number of states. We continue to deliver support to the Syrian Arab Republic in liquidation in disaster management. Search and rescue works, which included the participation of our EMERCOM officers, has always been completed. The Russian rescuers bravely dealt in the most complicated areas, the most destroyed areas. Aeromobile group of EMERCOM of Russia has returned to Russia. In the current phase, we focus on delivering emergent humanitarian aid to Syria. On the 10th of February, we delivered humanitarian aid, 70-ton humanitarian aid, including food and first aid items. So these items were distributed among the citizens of the affected areas with the support of the Reconciliation Center. This tragedy in Syria had a high-profile response in the Russian public. We continue raising funds in order to help those who are in need, including through our embassy in Moscow. Many people are participating in these actions. Non-commercial organizations, Russian regions are also engaged in this campaign. The Chechen Republic has sent about 72 tons of aid. We would like to mention that many other countries helped Syria as Russia, among them Azerbaijan, Algeria, Armenia, Bangladesh, Belarus, Venezuela, Vietnam, Egypt, Kazakhstan, China, Cuba, India, Iraq, Iran, Jordan, Lebanon, Libya, Arab Emirates, Pakistan, Palestine, Saudi Arabia, Sudan, Tajikistan, Tunisia, Turkey, Japan, even the EU members risked, I refer to Italy and Romania, they sent through an international Beirut airport medical equipment and first aid items. We can say that Turkey received aid from 21 countries. Then Syria received aid only from 9 countries of the European Union. And now you see a politicized story here. It's a bloody politicization. So it is unacceptable. I would like to mention that among those countries who supported Syria were the countries of the Arab world, so we can express hope that Syria can return to the Arab family. So this happened when close relatives in times of trouble of anyone settle their discords, which were insurmountable yesterday. And of course, we welcome such a positive trend. We underscore urgent lifting of all sanctions which restrict efforts on disaster management of this disaster in Syria. As for the question how this false agenda is gaining momentum, we would like to mention another fake by the United Kingdom. Of course, the center is Russia, the creation of a kind of stigmatization of Russia. The fourth channel, British channel, either inspiring or envying the authors voiced loudly themselves in the news of the film. I would like to voice it. I refer to the film, the fourth channel, Strippers, Spies, and Russian Money. These loud titles needed to attract the audience, which got tired of anti-Russia campaign, because it's another conspiracy theory, a substantiated conspiracy theory. So we cannot be...
There is one moment worth mentioning in the film. This film openly acknowledges that Mi-5 hack address books of the members of diplomatic services in the UK. So it's not about spying on private phones, but also they have access to the content of the mobile phones. This violation by London of diplomatic norms, including the Vienna Convention of 1961 and its international obligations, is unacceptable, and it's strange I have to mention this. In London, the Foreign Office and Mi-5 and Mi-6 do like investigations with accusations and convictions. Remember Skripals, cats, ducks, policemen. So the best traditions of criminal stories. Once again, this film, Strippers, Spies, and Russian Money, contains a direct accusation because it is not governed by the British law. Even if the West tries, despite the international law, to introduce some rules, there is still the national legislation. Have they cancelled it too in the UK? Our colleagues from other countries should be vigilant when dealing with British partners. Well, for us, they are no longer partners. Obviously, naturally, we do remember that you have to take one's word, gentleman's word, for granted, but we no longer consider them gentlemen. Talking about digital technologies, I should mention another story. Some days ago, there have been several materials published by investigative journalists who had gained access to the documents of the administration of the Twitter network. Noteworthy are both the results of this investigation, but also the lack of reaction from the White House and the State Department. Victoria Nuland, please pay attention to this topic, but let's start from the beginning. Not only experts on the US, but also laymen. Do you remember the large-scale or even total media campaign about the so-called Russian interference into the presidential elections in the US in 2016? It was launched by the Democrats and the mainstream they had controlled. It was done against Donald Trump, against the candidate. I'm not going to talk about the internal political differences and disputes, but it's not about them, it's about us. Collateral damage were Russian-US relations. As you remember, we were accused of interfering into the elections. Allegedly, Russians hacked everything possible and stole some data. And this allegedly affected the outcomes of the election. So as you remember, the outgoing President Obama expelled Russian diplomats and expropriated our property. One of the centers where false facts about Russian troll farms were generated was Hamilton 68 project. It was an initiative to fight against deliberately distorted information. It was a product of the Alliance for Democracy under the German Marshall Fund of the United States. This analytical center, think tank, is financed by several governments, including the US, Switzerland, and Germany. So who is on board? Wow, these are familiar people, but let me call their names. So they include such Russophobes as Michael Chertoff, former U.S. Secretary of Homeland Security, definitely Michael McFaul, former ambassador to Russia under Obama, Bill Kristol, ex-editor-at-large of the Weekly Standard, John Podesta, chair of the Hillary for America movement, and even Jake Sullivan was on the list on the board for some time, the current U.S. President Advisor for National Security. So it was a heavy mix of members of special services and media representatives. So what did this Hamilton 68 and Twitter administration do? It is at least a conspiracy between the greatest IT company and liberal establishment. Their goal was censorship of conservative points of views and dissemination of dogmas of democratic policy. By the way, Victoria Nuland, Byland, and Clinton promote this policy by brainwashing the US and world audience with the myth about Russian threat and influence. Throughout years, Hamilton 68 generated hundreds, if not thousands, of news about Russian bots. Their know-how was a secret source, a list of 644 accounts that allegedly, as they stated, were linked to Kremlin, and it could have gone on for decades. But suddenly, the journalists discovered this list in the Twitter materials. It turned out there were no Russians among them, almost no Russians, but many Americans. And it is nothing but fraud. They identified called Russian influence, simple talks and conversations between common conservatives. Plain fraud. While people were simply sharing their views, it was presented and sold as Russian interference. It is nothing but conspiracy. Conspiracy about the praised IT giants who ensure free exchange of opinions. And now, with this silence, when it comes to an investigation that is based on facts, suddenly they have no electricity, no power, and they can't turn on their computers. After the investigation of the U.S. journalist about the Nord Stream attacks was published, they continue to keep silence. Now, journalists that have nothing to do with Russia have already published their investigation. No word was uttered by the U.S. officials. These journalists were called as journalists who disseminate the conspiracy theories, and that's it. In the 60s, when the American deep state thought it was high time to start controlling the U.S. investigative journalists because the freedom of speech was their top ideal, they had to somehow limit the investigative journalists. So those who were working for these bodies could be defined as investigative journalists, and those investigative journalists who revealed some true facts, they didn't fit into the general line, started being called as those disseminating the conspiracy theories. So right now it has been revealed, but officials in the U.S. keep ignoring it. They keep ignoring the requests of journalists. So what about Hamilton 68 project? It stays alive. Now it's Hamilton 2.0 that has expanded its scope, and now it also analyzes disinformation from China and Iran. Such PR agencies disguised as Russophobic research and other NGOs with a secret financial financing are counting dozens in Washington and London. We are glad that many of those who were mentioned in this research, like Director General of the Global Association, the Public Relations and Communication Association, feel the effects, and the things don't go too well right now. Another example is the body financed by the US State Department, namely the Global Disinformation Index. This British organization with 2 affiliated US NGOs provide to advertising companies blacklists, so-called blacklists, in order to stop financing and closing conservative websites spreading alleged disinformation. This index was financed through the National Endowment for Democracy. But who financed this endowment? Well, in 2021, this National Endowment for Democracy received from the State Department $300 million. And also, I should mention the Global Engagement Center under the State Department. Undoubtedly, we will continue following and monitoring this interesting story, and will continue to draw your attention to these fake NGOs, because they are the very foundation of the Western system of lies, something they call the Western democracy. We see who is behind it. Western democracies spend much money for NGOs who clearly execute the orders of the administration paying to them. The sense is obvious: countering our country, using the Russia-related topics for internal political interests, and so on. We've mentioned repeatedly the section historical materials in the official MFA website. It contains examples of fabrication by Western countries of news in order to initiate aggression against other countries. But it turned out that we have enough materials for several white books, so we decided to launch at the website, ministry of the website, a new section and include into the whole archive that had been accumulated over the past years. The General White Books section will include the following materials: on material consequences of military intervention of the U.S. and its European allies 2022, the list of military crimes of the U.S. and its allies in Syria 2016, Syria tragedy with no statutory limitations 2016, White Book of violations by Western states of human rights standards under the guise of fight against terrorism and other criminal challenges and threats, annual reports about the situation with the human rights in certain countries, fight against heroization of glorification of Nazism, violations of rights of Russian citizens and compatriots in Western countries, about the deaths of civilians in Afghanistan, and let me stress in particular the materials on Ukraine, the White Book of violations of human rights in Ukraine, the tragedy of southeast of Ukraine, White Book of crimes, report about the situation with human rights in Ukraine 2020, the truth about the events in Ukraine and in Donbass 2014-2022. In the script of today's briefing, you'll find all the links, and today on the main page, on the home page of the website of the ministry, you'll see the banner redirecting the visitors to these materials, and they will be interesting for those who are interested in finding the truth. On the 18th of February, we celebrate the 75th anniversary of diplomatic relations between Russia and Myanmar. Our country have a long history of cooperation. The relations are based on our close positions to regional and global issues. The Soviet Union was one of the first ones to recognize the independence of Myanmar. Until 1989, the state was called Union of Burma, and the Soviet Union provided assistance in overcoming the devastated social and economic consequences of the colonial rule by the UK. With our assistance, the technological university was built, a hospital, and many other infrastructure and economic objects. Today we have a broad political dialogue, we have delegation exchange and broad contacts between various agencies, business and academic communities. We intend to build up our multifaceted cooperation. It was reaffirmed at the meeting between President Putin with President of the State Administration Council of Myanmar. It took place in September 2022 in Vladivostok, and also during the visit by Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Lavrov, to Naypyidaw in 2022. Ministers reached an agreement to enhance our coordination at international forum. Following the third session of the Intergovernmental Russian-Myanmar Commission on Trade and Economic Cooperation, specific steps have been outlined on a wide range of issues, including energy, peaceful and nuclear cooperation, industry, banking sector, information technologies, space cooperation, and so on and so forth. We state with satisfaction that we have an advanced cooperation with Myanmar. We intend to continue our work to build up potential for bilateral cooperation based on equality and mutual trust. On the 23rd of February, we will celebrate the 185th anniversary since the establishment of diplomatic relations between Russia and Serbia. On this occasion, there was an exchange of greetings between the Minister of Russia, Sergei Lavrov, and First Deputy Chairman of the Government, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Serbia, Mr. Dacic. Our nations have a close history, and today the relations between our two countries have a status of strategic partnership. Bilateral dialogue is characterized with openness, regular exchange of views. We compare our positions. The pillars of our cooperation are definitely trade and economic cooperation, cultural ties, joint work, and international fora. Russia provides assistance to Serbia in protecting its legitimate interests, sovereignty, and territorial integrity. with regards to the Kosovo issue in accordance with international law and the UN Security Council Resolution 1244. We cherish and value the high level of our relations with the Republic of Serbia, and we stand for further strengthening of these relations based on the rich traditions. And now to your questions. Международная жизнь. Are you with us? Yes. This year, Minister of National Defense of Poland, Maria Zakharova, said he didn't consider it a problem that Polish mercenaries were involved in the military conflict in Ukraine. How could you comment on this? I have seen the interview. I've seen links to the interview of the 13th of February. It's about the interview by the Polish Minister of Defense for Polsat News TV channel. He was asked about the number of citizens fighting in Ukraine. So the Polish minister gave no direct answer, and he said he didn't consider it a problem. So that's about the level of diplomacy. You know, they call it democracy, when one cannot get an answer to any direct question. So in the West, there is no longer any direct communication between the media and the authorities, as in this particular case. Let me answer to this Polsat News channel. Warsaw tries to play down the participation of its citizens in the Ukrainian conflict, although it is a glaring violation of the Polish legislation. Polish citizens are involved in training Ukrainian fighters. They have been doing it for decades. They trained those who later on, undercover and disguised as innocent protesters, were engaged in crimes and killings in Maidan in 2014. It is a clear demonstration of political recklessness of the Polish authorities, and on many times it got the country into trouble. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Do we have Portal Newsroom with us? Yes, good afternoon, Madam Zakharova. The State Department advisor Derek Chollis said that the United States do not plan to cooperate with Russia in the framework of the Arctic Council because of the special operation in Ukraine. He said that Washington is trying this way to adapt to realities. So how will Moscow is going to plan its policy within the framework of the Arctic Council? And how do you have your cooperation within the framework of other countries? We have good cooperation with the countries who understand the organization which it belongs to. If you are talking, if someone believes that you should not build on your cooperation, so this is their own problem, not the problem of the whole organization. On the other hand, we're not surprised by such a position of the State Department advisor, but because the only possibility not to cooperate with the Russian Federation is only the withdrawal from the Arctic Council of Washington. So all these, the functioning of the Arctic Council presupposes the participation of all the member countries. In the framework of this activity, we consider the results of the projects, including midterm, which are implemented by the participants of this organization. So in this concern, Russia, as a responsible member of the Arctic Council, believes that it is necessary to implement the decisions adopted in Reykjavik in 2021, which were frozen to their own detriment. We are guided, first of all, by the interests of international cooperation, and we will prevent any infringement of our national interests. And if the membership in this organization is not in line with this task, so we can consider any other options. And the second question. The State Department of the United States accused Russia of undermining efforts on the Armeno-Azerbaijan settlement in the format of the Minsk Group of OSCE. They are providing direct contacts with Baku and Yerevan to focus on this kind of mediation. So how Moscow may comments and sees the statement of the Americans. So a kind of a replacement. It was the Western countries who undermined these efforts. This Minsk group format was forgotten when the American co-chairs stopped in February 2022 their cooperation with Russian colleagues. So this is a fact. So there were not clear clarifications. They did not explain their actions. So we, taking into account this, we decided in a tripartite format to focus on the complex of top-level agreements. As for the U.S. mediation, we cannot see that it has any meaningful content and has any added value. Thank you very much. Is Anadolu with us? Yes, good afternoon, Maria Vladimirovna. We have 3 questions today, and the first question concerns the humanitarian aid to Turkey. Will Russia continue delivering humanitarian aid to Turkey after the departure of the Russian Emircom? Were there any negotiations at the level of the foreign ministries? And does Mr. Lavrov plan to visit Turkey as a sign of solidarity with the country after this earthquake? As a sign of solidarity, in my opinion, it is important to see actions aimed at supporting, at helping people, at humanitarian cargoes, at response to the requests. And this is the act of solidarity as I see it. Of course, these are political statements, expression of sympathy in public area. But first of all, this is a wide range of assistance which we are engaged in. Taking into account the scale of this disaster in the Turkish Republic, of course, we continue delivering its humanitarian aid. Currently, the Russian agencies are processing the requests coming from the Turkish side concerning the deliveries of the necessary equipment and materials. They collect and send humanitarian cargoes from separate Russian regions. As for the visits of our foreign minister, Mr. Lavrov, we will announce them if they are agreed. Thank you very much. The second question. Last week, the Western countries, referring to the special operation in Ukraine, urged their countries to leave Russia and to refuse to go to Russia and to Belarus. How Moscow assesses such activities? Do you expect that some other states can provide the same recommendations in the near future? And did Mr. Rybkov and Ms. Tracy discussed this question during their negotiations? As you know, that's another provocation with regard to the statements of the State Department to the U.S. citizens to refuse to go to Russia and to Belarus, and to leave it if they are already in the country. So such kind of objections about the arrests, about the scary stories of harassment, of bad treatment, or arbitrary detainment, which the authorities cannot inform, on which the authorities cannot inform the U.S. embassy, or these stories are told to those citizens who are going to Russia. It is exactly the U.S. authorities who encourage this notorious cancel culture, waging a real hunting after the Russians in the third countries. These false persecutions, if they have a goal, so they can take them. So all those who are victims of this punitive justice system of the United States are risking to receive huge lifetime imprisonments and to be deprived of their assets and all the money. As you remember, the people, the children who were kidnapped, their imprisonment terms, they were just funny. For the death of a child, they received nothing. And if the people who possess a Russian passport, they can be subjected to all kinds of pressure, including arrest and eternal imprisonment terms. And that's the difference. That's the true attitude to human rights, to the values, to moral values. So the existing laws are changing now in order to ensure to take the assets and the property out of the citizens of Russia. And I would like to mention that recommendations not to go to the United States is relevant as never before, remains relevant as never before. As for our contacts with the U.S. Embassy, we've transferred a special note to them that stating that they need to behave in an appropriate way in the digital environment. Thank you very much. And now the third question concerns Israel. Since the beginning of Operation Ukraine, Israel maintained neutrality and even tried to be a mediator. First of all, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Israel, Mr. Cohen, said that Israel will silence with regard to military operation in Ukraine. And then he went there in order to open his embassy and expressed support to Ukraine. Mr. Cohen was the first Israeli minister who visited Ukraine after this beginning of the special operation. So how do you see this attitude of Israel? So you were right when you said that in Israel there are different politicians who come to power, who have different approaches. Of course, we have our own approaches with regard to international agenda with various administrations in this country. We do not conceal this, and we express our concerns in the public environment as well as during briefings. We have maintained a trustful dialogue on a wide range of international issues. We discuss the Ukrainian issues as well. So on many matters, we are managing to find mutual understanding in the spirit of friendship. At the same time, I would like to underline that we have divergent approaches, but this does not interfere to cooperate on different areas of mutual interest, as well as with regard to the peaceful settlement in Ukraine. Do we have media corporation of China with us? Yes, good afternoon. We have one question. In the article of several hash, with the Nord Stream explosions, the American mass media almost ignored. And on the 15th of February, Mr. Hirsch published a post where the leading American media concealed the truth about the explosions in pipelines. We've already commented on this. It's a kind of conspiracy. When the U.S. administration in various the relevant special services and media outlets, as well as traditional digital platforms. So it's nothing new there. What is surprising is their large-scale profile, because we are talking about terrorist acts at the global scale. In fact, as we remember, international terrorist acts, either regional or local, in the framework of any states, has always caused a kind of a sympathy. People changed their photos, they colored the buildings in the countries as a sign of solidarity. Fortunately, no one fell a victim, but in fact, it was a destruction of a civilian infrastructure. The only reaction was a frustration and nothing else. And now the journalist is trying to find the truth and sees that his authorities are silencing as if nothing had happened. That's why many American journalists tried to understand what had happened then. And then their conclusions, based on the facts and materials they found out, so that when they published it, it became even worse, because these journalists are tried to be persecuted or accused of being mad. They are also being ignored at the briefings of the State Department and the White House. Now I have a question. Even though they see that this is not a question of their attention, where are the facts which the U.S. administration can publish? And if the facts of this journalist Hirsch are funny, they are not in line of the lofty ideals of democracy, where are they who deserve to be published? Where are the facts that could be published by the U.S. administration? It announced itself as a world global police engaged in all the global matters. It eavesdropping all its allies, conducts operations throughout the globe. It invades the countries. So what happened with the Nord Stream? I believe that they have such information. They knew what happened in the United Kingdom with the so-called Novichok, and they were guided by these decisions. They knew all that happened in some other parts of the world. This is the zone of responsibility of NATO. And as you know, this happened on the territory controlled by the NATO countries, headed by the United States. So I believe that this region is stuffed with intelligence equipment, military infrastructure, with everything. So what happened there? It's a direct question to the U.S. administration. If the investigations published are devalued by the U.S., they should provide their own version, because they've spoken for many years. They've expressed their interest and disinterest. They voiced the desire to destroy this project. Now they should voice their own version of what had happened, and not the version. It should be provided with a biased and grounded information, because they have such facts and evidence, because this region is under their surveillance systems. And that's all that I can say. I would like to mention that on the 22nd of February, Russia decided to convene in the UN Security Council a meeting with regard to these explosions in Nord Stream. So we will demand a kind of investigation of what had happened, despite the UN Just Secretary General said, and I quote, "The UN has no mandate to carry out such investigations." So it would be good if everyone can define their own mandates. So we've seen a lot of things previously when the UN international organizations, which have no any mandate for carrying out investigations, to do so. As you know, it's not just a terrorist act. It's terrorist act against civilian infrastructure, which caused colossal environmental implications, which triggered a kind of movement of the world global system. This is a terrorist act which triggered the destruction of many corporations, firms, companies. I'm not talking about the expenses by the dozens and millions of citizens, I mean of the European continent. This is a terrorist act, influenced the economic area as well as the environmental. So we need to understand what had happened. If you have no questions, then we'll move on further. Do we have Moscow Post with us? Yes, good afternoon. The U.S. ambassadors reaffirmed the creation of a special working group to use the frozen Russian assets. Mr. Lavrov said that its lawfulness. He also mentioned the transfer of payments, international currencies, as well as the creation of alternative financial institutions. How can Moscow answer to the European Union and to the European Union countries if the Russian assets will be used by the EU? I would like to say that if this money are used by the EU, it's a legitimate measure. It violates the norms of commercial and international law, and the EU plans to use the Russian assets to serve their own political and economic tasks. We consider them as an infringement on the sovereign property. And of course, this will be followed by an adequate reaction on our side. Of course, we don't want any involvement of such a situation, and we urge the West to return to the principle of democracy strictly proclaimed by the West, as well as to the independence of the judicial system, independent of any political demands and slogans. And of course, first of all, the independence of the judicial system, which the West tried to question after that chaos which is happening there. It is exactly underpinned by these foundations of the world order, including the financial and economic sphere. The Russian authorities considers all legal mechanisms to return access to Russian foreign assets. And refusal of non-friendly states to cooperate with Russian legal framework demonstrates the dependence of the status of sovereign assets, national assets, from geopolitical opportunistic approaches of some Western countries.
Well, here we can think of the expression from the Old Testament, today it's you, tomorrow it will be someone else. We call on the international community to pay due attention to these events and don't follow the Western extortioners. All the Western slogans that had been applied to other countries whose assets had been blocked changed to the contrary over time. Remember Venezuela? They said it was the illegitimate government of Venezuela, so they had to extort money from Venezuela, and when legitimate Guaido was to take over the false president of Venezuela, he would be given money back. Now no one wants to shake hands with Guaido. He has been written off, to use the modern language. And that's it. You see, over a couple of years, the political slogan that was proclaimed by the West changed to exactly the opposite, and now they visit President Maduro. For us, he has always been the legitimate president, as if nothing had happened. Can you imagine this? So everything they are saying now with regards to our country, their accusations against our country, these attempts to threaten and blackmail everyone in Russia and all those who want to cooperate with us, can change to the opposite in a moment. Remember, it will change overnight. And with the same shameless faces, they will state they were simply misunderstood, they didn't mean it, or they would say it belongs to the past, let us now look into the future. In future, other independent countries who believed into the financial system built by the West can experience all the virtues of its so-called biased principles unless they give due reaction to the violations of today. You know, we shouldn't use barbaric means. We simply shouldn't. It is a way to nowhere. It is something we have already seen in the past, something we shouldn't repeat anymore. As you know, European countries have traditionally been large investors into the Russian economy, and they have profited from it. It led to concentration of significant assets of European companies in our country, and by the way, they highly exceed the amounts of frozen Russian resources abroad. It's just to remind you. Obviously, we are always guided by the law, and we always give a last chance to the common sense of our partners. But at the same time, we are ready to take any steps to protect our national property up to the application of equal compensatory measures. Thank you. Second question. In October last year, you spoke about the fact that officers of the UN Secretariat should follow the principles of equidistance. Mr. Lavrov also mentioned the topic of privatization by the West of leading positions in international organizations. What mechanisms are there to prevent such injustice? Well, when we demand from the UN Secretariat that it strictly follows the principles of impartial treatment and equidistance, we refer to the latent spirit of the UN Charter. I quote an article from the UN Charter. In the performance of their duties, the Secretary General and the staff shall not seek or receive instructions from any government or from any other authority external to the organization. They shall refrain from any action which might reflect on their position as international officials responsible only to the organization. Once again, it's Article 100 of the UN Charter, and Russia has always considered the Charter as the cornerstone of the international legal system. As for privatization of the leading UN bodies, the trend to fill them with citizens of Western countries is a source of concern, and it's outrageous. This is particularly dangerous against the backdrop of increased attempts by the US and its allies to subject the organization to its vested interests and turn it into the interest to exert pressure on unfavorable states, including Russia. However, we should bear in mind that Article 101 of the UN Charter mentions the need to consider the principle of fair geographic representation when taking decisions about recruiting staff for the Secretariat. So it's not about our whims. It's simply about the commitment to the basic principles laid on paper. Our country has been consistent in its calls for the UN Secretary General and the Secretariat to respect the Charter provisions in cooperation with our like-minded partners. We try to make sure that principles of impartiality and equidistance are stressed in the decisions of the leading bodies, governing bodies of the organization. Besides, if we face clear violations of the principle of fair geographical representation, we sometimes should have to simply block the appointments to some positions of special representatives of Secretary General. Thank you. And my final question. In the interview to Russia Today, Director of the department, Mr. Philipson, said our military and technical cooperation has purely applied value. Would you please explain what your colleague meant? What role is military and technical cooperation playing in the foreign policy? Well, since you requested such a clarification, let me refer you to the federal law of 1998, number 114. It contains a definition. It is activity in the field of international relations that is related to imports, exports, including supplies or purchases, as well as development of military products. Military and technical cooperation with foreign states is one of the key components of foreign policy of any state, which is which has a significant potential in the field of defense and industry. In developing this potential and military cooperation, we resolve issues in a wide range of fields and try to ensure the national security of our country and promote its military, political, and economic interests in a legitimate way, obviously, in accordance with international law and based on national legislation. Russia considers military technical cooperation as a means to enhance the level of the use of force in global affairs. The supplies of Russian arms aim to strengthen the defense capability of the countries who receive it and maintain the regional balance of power, stability, and security for Russia as one of world's key producers and exporters of weapons. For us, military technical cooperation is a priority topic in interstate relations. It contributes to greater presence of Russia in various regions and strengthening friendly relations with the recipient countries. But I would like to ask you to quote me as I said it. Please don't quote me out of context, because our military and technical cooperation consists of many aspects and elements. Moscow, Baku, are you with us? Yes, we have the following question. Next week, on the 22nd of February, we will mark the anniversary since the signature by leaders of Russia and Azerbaijan of the historic document, the Declaration of Allied Cooperation. How do you assess the effectiveness of implementation of this document? What importance does it have in the current situation? And there have been reports that in the end of the month, Mr. Lavrov will visit Baku. Is it true? Are there any advances in the case of peaceful agreement between Azerbaijan and Armenia? While as for the visit by Mr. Lavrov, we'll announce it in due time if it happens. As for your first question, the document lays down the new quality of cooperation between our countries. It sets out the vectors for development of cooperation for years ahead. Allied relations between our countries is a stabilizing factor on the regional and global level. Together with Baku, we are working to implement its provisions. And a number of events have been planned to mark the anniversary of its signature. As for the planned visit, I have already answered your question. And as for the peace agreement between Azerbaijan and Armenia, we can continue to provide assistance to our partners. We keep informing you about it. Recently, there have been useful contacts in Yerevan and in Baku. Special representative by Mr. Lavrov, Mr. Igor Hovayev, held some contacts. Both sides reaffirmed the interest in seeing Russia as an intermediary. This topic is very sensitive, so I'm not going into detail, but we are ready to organize another meeting between the ministers of foreign affairs of Armenia and Azerbaijan on this topic. Vedomosti newspaper, are you with us? Good afternoon. We would like to request some details regarding the Arctic Council. Last week, there has been information about the consultations with participation of the Ministries of Foreign Affairs from Latin America and Persian Gulf. Does it mean that Russia plans any joint projects together with them? With whom? With countries from Latin America and the Persian Gulf. Well, I will clarify it with my colleagues. I don't have such information. It's not because we don't have this information as such, but it's quite a specific question. I'll clarify it with my colleagues and we'll get in touch with you later. And is it possible that the Council continues its activity without Russia? Well, you know, when they speak about the G20 without Russia, it's not the G20 any longer. Russia cannot be compensated or replaced, nor can you give any explanation to the substitution. It will mean that the very sense of this organization will cease to exist. Same with this Arctic Council. There are principles, and you can't say that these principles are detached from reality. The mechanisms of this council, its experience, its expertise, its principles reflect the goals, the interests of the countries participating in this body. If one simply removes one element after another from the structure, then it would simply mean an end to the law and any agreements. That's exactly what Western governments are trying to do. They invent various rules, not to replace, but rather to eliminate the legal norms that regulate the work of international organizations. So if someone wants to change something, to revise something, then it will lead to the establishment of a different body. If they don't want to participate on an equal basis, they should leave the council on their own and don't prevent others from working. Will you give your answer regarding Latin America and the Persian Gulf today? Yes, definitely. After what I've seen on the screen today, I have got so much inspiration that I'll never forget it anymore. Tverskaya 13, are you with us? Yes, good afternoon. We have 3 questions. During the last briefing, you paid attention to the disaster in Turkey and the help of Emercom Russia. Our country was one of the first ones to provide assistance to Turkey after the earthquake. According to the ambassador of Russia in Turkey, Mr. Yerhov, the leadership of Turkey enhanced the volumes of weapons supplied to Ukraine. How can you comment on the actions of Turkey, its response to the helping hand of Russia? Well, I can say that we qualify any actions that lead to escalation of conflict as very dangerous. And we have warned everybody a long time ago that all weapons supplied to Ukraine that will be used to kill our citizens, they will be considered by our side as a legitimate target with all the consequences. That's my first point. So here our position is known to you. It applies to any country that is supplying weapons or plans to do so. We don't divide countries into good or worse. Any countries supplying the criminal Kyiv regime with weapons, regimes that has been eliminating citizens for many years, were considered as a threat and as something that demands our response on the field. Well, as for our assistance to Turkey, well, I've already mentioned it when answering the question by Anadolu. You know, there are many political figures in the world, many regimes in the world, and many personalities who lose their human qualities. But it doesn't mean that we should lose our human qualities, our human approach. We have different values, and these values prevent us from ignoring people when they are in need of help. And another important moment, we are providing assistance to those people who are faced with such a problem. We know what man-made disasters are. We know what earthquakes are. We know it from our common past, from the Soviet Union times. These tragedies affected various republics, and the whole country considered them as something that affected them all directly. As soon as we realized what Syria and Turkey are going through right now, we couldn't but provide assistance, and it is assistance to specific people. And now my third point, it's very important. You know how many our citizens are in Turkey, live in Turkey, and not simply spend their holidays or temporarily there, but live there permanently, have families in that country, and how many citizens of our country have been directly or indirectly affected by this tragedy. So, among other things, we are providing assistance to our citizens with Russian passports, to our compatriots, to those who have ties to the victims. So, I don't think that I can respond to this question in a straightaway manner. It is a very complex issue. Getting back to your question, I should say that we on our own should remember what we are countering. We are countering the situation where people, countries are losing human qualities, so we shouldn't turn into those whom we are fighting. Any further questions? Yes. Ex-Foreign Minister of Poland, Fotyga, said Russia should be decolonized and its natural resources should be divided. It proposed that Western countries think of a concept of establishment of free and independent countries on the pro-Russian territories with indigenous peoples as a cornerstone. Will Western countries should take care of their prosperity? Do you think it is another attempt to destabilize the situation? Well, as for decolonization of Russia, it is something which the Western states should think of. For centuries, for decades, they have been thinking about turning our country into a colony. It is part of their mentality, and I know what the Polish representative was talking about.
That we are kind of a metropoly, so we can be dismembered. It's absurd. So when you can live 1,000 years with each other and then find out that we are a kind of metropoly or colonies, I don't want to dwell on this psychoanalysis after declarations of some Polish politicians. I would like to return to my idea. Indeed, this is a very important trend which should be seen in the Russophobic Western politicians. They wanted us to make colonies, a kind of supplier of commodities, make a kind of hybrid colony. And indeed, we opposed to this. And right now, we are telling them the inadmissibility of even thinking about this. Our resources are bothering them for many years. They came to us for many times, mainly from the West. They received nothing, and we had to fight for this. And we had to defend the resources which were given to us in historical terms and which we use in a reasonable way, which we protect and share in a peaceful manner with the whole planet, with not only with our neighbors, but also with our partners, and not even partners, as it turns out. And we continue to do so, doing it in a mutually beneficial way, because there is a kind of historical justice there. But coming to them and trying to rob them, to subjugate us, and to force us leave the control of the resources, so they won't do so. then they will fail. And these ideas are not new one. And trying to revive this unipolar model under the slogan of a unipolar of the world-based, rule-based order, they're using any efforts, pressure, provocations, blackmail, intimidation of the unwanted, the use of force. They also use an information war. They endlessly repeat that we have to collapse and then the Russian issue will be settled. They are talking about this directly. And what surprises me, when the Russian foreign minister, and by answering to all these voices, he is accused of some parallels. We do not make any historical parallels. They tell us the same phrases which were told our people as well as other peoples as well in the midterm in the 50s of the 20th century, because the words, and this meant that finally we have to get rid of Russia. After a many-year or a long confrontation with Russia, we need to get rid of Russia, and that is the end of the decision or a final resolution of the question which these countries themselves are bearing in mind and are trying to resolve. They have been doing so for many decades, and that's the question to them, for how long they are doing in this senseless business. This is a kind of information war, and so the proposals you voiced, the so-called proposals of the satellites of Washington, it's not the only evidence of this ill ideology. It's yet another confirmation of the real nature of our partners, about their plans with regard to our country. It is clear enough for us that the existence of Russia as the main basic systematic elements on the vast Eurasian space represents a problem for many of our opponents. We cannot resort to equal rights. They can use the way they can do so, but history teaches that any attempts to shatter the Russian statehood, to drive a wedge into their community as well as to claim the territorial integrity, promotes consolidation of our peoples, encourages the consolidation of the key areas of our life. At the same time, they reaffirm inability to negotiate and their false intentions, which strengthens us in our position to focus on another vectors of our foreign policy. You've cited yourself the Polish former head of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Poland, which stated such an announcement. Today we cited many other representatives which also voiced that Russia has to be beaten, that they need to win over Russia, and they should make Russia defeat. Now I have a question. It's not a rhetoric one, because the answer is obvious. Can you imagine what would be with this world if our resources given to us, which we use ourselves, and with which we share on a mutually beneficial basis and fair conditions, can you imagine if all these resources be concentrated in the hands of these nations who want Russia's defeat? And I will answer you by the words of their representatives. They would do everything to concentrate such resources in their hands only, because it is a beautiful garden. So this should have been in this beautiful garden. All the rest, who is not affiliated to this garden, should be denied in these benefits. They would manipulate, they would set high prices, they would provide no chance for the development of any other parts of our world. They would do anything in order to prosper many golden billions. They would establish a quota for a prosperous life, just for a prosperous life. It's not even that. I'm talking about the talents, the creative potential of these people, so they would never be unlocked in the regions which they believe are secondary and a kind of jungles, according to Mr. Borrell, and that's it. And that's terrible. Outrageous, segregacious statement. This is racism, as it is, because it's not only racism is based not only on geographical representation or the skin color. It's a division of people into 1, 2, or 3 sorts. Now it's just been revitalized because the Western elites have been faced an ideological impasse. So someone finds sources to overcome such impasses, and someone tries to whip up hysteria and opens any cards and casts off all the masks. And this is exactly what happened with the West. And our next question. The former, I'm sorry, as for you have said, so it's shameless to voice such things by the Polish policeman for one reason only. Hitler followed this very ideology. We made him go out not only from Russia but also from Poland. It was exactly the Red Army who liberated Poland and saved lives of the Polish people. So it's shameless to pronounce such announcement by revitalizing the Nazi ideology of Hitlerism with regard to our country. They should feel shameless. They should have feel ashamed. Yes. And our next question. The former officer of the National Security Advisor, Edward Snowden, information from Washington on unidentified flying objects is yet another attempt to divert attention from explosions at Nord Stream. How do you think? Can this theory exist? I believe that this is an attempt to divert attention from the existing U.S. agenda. We are seeing elections very soon. The results of Mr. Biden's administrations are outrageous. We see scandals which they're trying to conceal behind huge monies. This is corruption. This is bad behavior of representatives of the whole regime, this group, and their actions. The second thing is the roots and the sources of this open phase of confrontation in Ukraine, which is related to business interests of this Biden clan. The third moment are huge amounts of dirty things which are being surfaced. These are the things connected with the close circle of the current administration of the White House. So they have nothing to promote in these elections. Total failures, destruction of any indexes, as press secretary stated, who said, if you do not speak out the word recession, so it won't happen. So when she said, we don't need to mention recession, so that is the logic. All and everything is upside down. So they have great problems, both national and foreign. So they need a kind of a foreign factor to divert attention from their national agenda. So we have UFOs, commissions, and the second point, as I've just said, and I quote, Snowden, this is investigation of the Nord Stream. These are intercomplementary things, but this is a specific action. It's a specific story. It's not just a UFO. That's the thing which damaged our planet. And we have direct questions that they must answer. And now they do not want to answer them, and they're trying to divert any discussions by hiding with UFOs and issues. Do we have Ambassador's Life with us? Is Ambassador's Life with us? Good afternoon, Madam Zakharova. Yes, good afternoon. We have two small questions. An updated concept of the foreign policy of Russia provides for the need to stop monopoly of the West at defining international framework, as said our foreign minister stating at the government hour meeting. And these frameworks should be defined on the basis of balance of interest in the UN Charter. So how will we react on the permanent discrimination of the Russian symbols, anthem and flag on the international arena? As for our sports, maybe we can consider a mirror response with respect to those who disrespect the symbols of our country. You've mentioned the concept of the Russian Federation, an updated concept, so I won't dwell on this because it's in the stage of finalization. And I believe that very soon everyone will familiarize with it. So let us not anticipate. We should better familiarize ourselves with the original version because it has not been finalized yet. As for the national symbols, I would like to remind we have Article 329 of the Criminal Code of the Russian Federation with the limitation of imprisonment up to 3 years or forced labor or an arrest. So we won't talk about bad things right now. So the article says is to punish any insult of the anthem or coat of arms. This is a criminal offense. So we don't need to elaborate some new laws. There is a law. And if the symbols are insulted and desecrated, and we've seen this for many times, the relevant article should be applied. I understand what you are talking about. And in some other states, for the insult of the state symbols are even stricter than in our countries. These terms can be longer, fines are higher. For France, for example, for the insult of the flag or anthem, can imprison up to 6 months or make a fine to up to 7,500 euros. In Austria provides for criminal prosecution. The criminal can be imprisoned up to 6 months or pay a 4,000 or 5,000 euros. In Germany, a malicious expression of scorn to the coat of arms or anthem, you can receive a 3-year imprisonment. The fines are counted on the basis of amount, so about 1 to 30,000 euros per 24 hours and multiplied on the number of days. In Turkey, if you burn a flag, you can receive 3-year imprisonment. For the public insult of the anthem, you can receive from 6 to 2 years imprisonment. But as for the political component, if we need to provide a mirror response, and I would like to repeat what I've said, dehumanization should not become the pretext for our own dehumanization. So right now, we need to confront to everyone. That is why our soldiers are paying lives for us, because we need to maintain the most valuable things given to us by our ancestors who defended our human dignity, not to become just animals. So how can we become like them? No way. By the way, when I say there, we all understand that there are beautiful, sincere, and open-minded, intelligent people who were just broken because they were victims of the kind of political machine. Now they are trying to make out of Russia a kind of historical civilization. They are trying to cancel it. And as for the people who are subjugated by their own orders and rules, even in their best encouragements, they are trying to confront, they just cannot deny it. It's a very thin line. We need to show that you do not accept this. You need to use your legislation framework. You need to answer in a mirror way when it is adequate, to underline the inadmissibility of actions against any categories of our citizens, including by placing our partners out of zone of their comfort because they got used that we maintain their zone of comfort. Recently, a few days ago, Mr. Lavrov met with foreign journalists. There was an open part and they talked in a working format, in a closed format. And the Western journalists from unfriendly states voiced on many occasions that it's hard to work in Russia now because they now have to form visas, to accreditations more often than before. You see that they got used to a comfortable life. So they enjoyed the regime of maximum benefits. When at this moment one moment they received visas, when our foreign journalists were honorable guests in our country, when they were revealed to the rank of our own journalists and possessed all the rights of journalists in accordance with our law on mass media. Maybe someone benefited. There are, in fact, a shameful attitude, ignorance, approval of the actions of their own authorities, illegitimate actions with respect to Russian journalists. They even participated in persecution of Russian journalists as it was in Germany. The Union of Journalists in Germany, they just persecuted journalists with their personal data, names, insults. Now everything has ended up. So they will live a new life, they will form new documents as it should be. So if they do their job professionally, so they will work in our country. If they do not work as professionals, so the foreign journalists won't work in Russia if they conduct activities which is not in line with their state.
Now,
If they disrespect ourselves, our country, our peoples, then they have nothing to do here in our country if they behave in this way. More than that, 1 year ago, a number of British and US media, most of them are already hybrid media. What did they say in February and March 2022? We will not work in your country at all. We are leaving your country. Well, they didn't have anything better to threaten us with. We asked them a simple question. Are you going for holiday? Then please leave your accreditations and we'll cancel your accreditations, or are you going to come back? Or are you leaving forever? Then, after a short time of thinking, they said it was simply for rotation purposes, and many of them stayed and others came back after a short time of absence. With the exception of some media like Bloomberg. Probably they know they have done something here that they should better stay away from Russia. We are not going to behave like them, and we will provide comfortable conditions for their work, not only when it is needed, but when it is considered as a friendly gesture from our part. If you have no further questions, and it seems to me there should be no further questions, from your part. Then let's turn to Radio Saga. Good afternoon. Let me say that as for myself personally, on my office, we have never shown any disrespect to your country. Yes, I know how much you cherish and value your professional renommee. You know who I'm talking about. I named them. It was a démarche. Well, remember, please understand me. I beg your pardon, but I have to say this. When it comes to some landmark events, all journalists gather there to build up their offices, to have the possibility to directly report about the situation for the audiences. What sort of journalists do Western media have? If on one single day they all declared about their intent to leave our country, well, if you wish to leave the country, why declaring it? They did make public announcements. Why? Because they were part of a political campaign of exerting psychological pressure on our and world society. They made a circus out of it, and when they realized that their competitors gained grounds, they got back. But we remember it. So you know what I'm talking about. There have been no parallels, hardly any parallels in history when events of global significance broke out in some region and the journalists fled that region, not because of any threats posed to their lives and health, but for political motives. It means they have nothing to do with journalism. Probably they represent some businesses or political parties that seeks to preserve its capital, although there was no threat to capital too, either. But I can't understand how journalists Western journalists rejected this possibility to cover a situation, to report about the situation that was of global importance. But that's what we've seen. And I'm sorry, you know what followed next? Next, they started calling us and saying, we would like to resume our relations. We would like to have the possibility to cover the situation. Why do you bypass us? Why don't you send us any invitations? What sort of invitations can we send to you when you all left our country, when you made your choice in favor of some political considerations? Well, I'm sorry. Now to your question. Yes, I have two short questions, if I may. And now that ties between Europe and Russia are being cut off completely, what are the future options? What future should we expect in your view? What should happen for normalization of the relations? Well, I don't know. I can hardly say it. We never poisoned our relations. We had done everything to make sure that we maintain our relations. When you speak about new foundations for our relations, what do you mean by that? We need relations based on international law and bilateral agreements based on the principles of mutual respect. They should be modern, dynamic, with an element with a touch of interdependence, the sense that we share our times, a sort of a unity or historical fate at some stages. That's what we were trying to achieve. We offered major projects. We implemented such projects despite everything. And to some extent, we have demonstrated unprecedented openness and goodwill, and so on and so forth. But you know how it ended. Not only didn't they understand us, I think they did, but there in the West, they couldn't take the independent, I'm talking about Europe, they couldn't take the independent political sovereign decision to build relations with Russia, relations of a new sort. But under the pressure of the US, Europe rejected any proposals made by the Russian side. And more than that, Europe started destroying relations on its own. So how we should rebuild the relations is the question you should address to someone else. We cannot offer our friendship cooperation forever, because when every time it is rejected, when they lead to provocations, when they keep accusing us. We have other countries to build our relations with, our partners in BRICS, ASEAN, African countries. BRICS, SCO, African continent, Latin America, that's where the value-friendly relations, where we can use the law as the basis for our cooperation and respect our mutual value, reciprocal values. And who does Russia rely on when Mr. Lavrov speaks of multipolar world and the fair world order? You have just mentioned the privatization by the West of the leading positions, and you mentioned also the criminal interests. You probably meant the UN, the OSCE. Whom will Russia rely on? I've already mentioned this. I've mentioned these new regional centers of global development, of a multipolar world order. And next thing, let's wait till the new concept of foreign policy of Russia is published. It will be laid out in that concept. You will see the logic, the trends in our foreign policy. All right, thank you. Media Alliance of Russian Communities, are you with us? Yes. Patriotic compatriots are always with you, and I'm with you. Very well. We are glad that we have such an alliance. I have a question that has already been raised on many occasions, but it turned out that not only in Russia, but also in other countries, like in Slovakia, for example, the decision by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Poland to fire the MGIMO alumni was published. How can you comment on this? Well, I don't know why they were fired, what the official reason was. They had been speaking about it for many years. They had attacks of Russophobia, and they looked for different ways to apply their Russophobia, to give way to it. But you know, such purges have had examples in history. It was considered as a norm, and they even had an ideological foundation. I wonder what they are going to do with these people who are great professionals because they got the education in Russia, like doctors, for example. Will these people be tortured too? And most importantly, I think all these activists, personalities in Warsaw should refresh their knowledge of obligations under the Council of Europe and the OSCE. It is clearly written that they should respect the human dignity and respect freedom of opinion, pluralism of opinions, and so on and so forth. And most definitely such notions that like bullying or trolling don't fit into the norms of civilized countries that have subscribed to the respect of human dignity and so on and so forth. And in truly civilized countries, people are normally accused after they have committed offenses or there are grounds to suspect them of having committed some offenses, and it is done through the law enforcement agencies. But any sort of persecution in a situation when the person has not made any offense, there is, it means that what they define as bullying. And then this bullying takes the form of purges. When, since you are MGIMO alumni too, tell us, are there any secrets of which the West fears, or what are your advantages in the field of arts, culture? Well, that's a good question. Yes, indeed. In MGIMO, MGIMO gives such knowledge that distinguishes its alumni from alumni of other countries and other universities. MGIMO alumni know that there are no such distances of hundreds of thousands of kilometers. That's the distance between Earth and the Moon. And unlike Ms. Baerbock, who is the foreign minister of Germany and has European education and Anglo-Saxon education, unlike her, MGIMO students, even students, not only alumni, know that there are no such distances between countries as hundreds of thousands of kilometers. They know that Baltic Sea and the Black Sea are different seas that are geographically located in different parts of the world. Unlike the Prime Minister and then Prime Minister of the UK, who thought that the best way to get to the Baltic Sea for North Europe would be to go through the Baltic Sea, or through the Black Sea. Indeed, that's that very secret that MGIMO as university gives to its students. It instills respect for international law, and most importantly, people are not being segregated. There is no distinction between worthy or unworthy, good or bad people, only due to their race and ethnicity. But MGIMO tries to unite people, and if people are being divided into worthy or unworthy, then only on the grounds of their behavior and their ability to operate with historical facts. And that's something that drives the Western partners crazy, because they are not used to hear historical facts. And it is a visiting card of MGIMO alumni. The rector of the MGIMO University is an outstanding researcher, and his contribution to the history science can not be overestimated. So this love and knowledge to history is something he tries to instill to his students. So this personal involvement of Mr. Tarkunov makes a difference. He encourages to learn history, being himself a person and the author of many books. And his scientific and applied activities serve to the promotion of history as science. Thank you very much. And Ria Novosti have one question. Ведомости, sorry, for Vedomosti. Do you have any information for us? We will get back to you later. We'll call you back. Thank you.